Day Assembly. We appreciate all those that were in attendance for our Bible class, and now that we have this time to worship together, and we're continuing our discussion on the ways of the wanderers in understanding why it is that people wander away from God, from the church, from His truth, but not only understanding why it is that others wander away, but even in thinking about ourselves, helping us to understand, why might I be tempted to wander away and be drawn away from God? We have been going through a discussion that Jeremiah has been presenting to the people of his day, the children of Israel, and how that they had in fact wandered away from God and how it was leading to God's judgment upon them as a nation. And in giving them a picture on what they were actually doing, God describes Himself as being a stream of living water, pure, crisp, giving to you all that you would need in finding fulfillment in one's life. And how it was that people had turned away from Him, rejected that, and hewn them out cisterns, broken cisterns that are not able to hold any water. How that stemmed from a position that they were forgetting all the good things that God had done for them. That's what we discussed last week. Forgetting that one has forgotten. You deceive yourselves, or we deceive ourselves. And that we no longer hold on to what it was that drew us to God in the first place. The imagery that God gave in that discussion was with the question of, can a maid forget her jewelry? Can a bride forget her wedding garment? And obviously the answer to that question is no. But then when we're considering what we need to take into view when we do this, when we are considering why it is that people are unfaithful to their spouses, well, it's all stemming from this, and that these are things that are designed to help us to keep from doing that. But oftentimes, the reason why unfaithfulness creeps in is that because of selfish desires. I'm only thinking of myself. And then I'm not considering what my actions are doing to the other person involved in this party. That's the next thing that God and Jeremiah ends up bringing into view in this discussion. Last week it was Jeremiah 2:32. Can a maid forget her ornaments, or a bride her attire? Yet my people have forgotten me days without number. And we discussed the loneliness, the lonely feeling that comes from this. So when a person wanders, here's what it is really like. What exactly are we studying in all of this discussion? We're getting down to the heart of what's going on with this. Why is God describing this to His people? What is it that He's trying to have them recognize? What's the picture that's being painted for us? Jeremiah 2:13. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns, that can hold no water. If you remember last week, we spent a great deal in discussing that marriage relationship that God has with His people, and we said that's going to come into play this week. The word forsaken goes deeper than how we often contemplate it. We've mentioned this in our studies in the past, especially in our Matthew study. We have a brain that tries its best to take the path of least resistance. If we can go autopilot, our brain will try to do that. We read the word forsaken, and our brain automatically goes, oh, I know what that word means. I know what that word means, and usually we stick to a very basic, generic definition. And again, we're going to emphasize as to how important and how crucial word studies are. Because I'm sure, and what we're going to discuss today, and it's not that I just have this world out here that I live in that the rest of you are not living in, but I recognize that I have tools at my disposal that allows me to pull back layers on what's being presented that most people do not take into consideration when they're thinking about this word, forsake, and what it means, what is actually going on when God's people forsake Him. Now, anyone here, show of hands, ever been jilted? Do we even know what that word means? This is another word in our English that can be used in defining the word for forsaken. And this word jilted, to be jilted, is a painful experience. Jilted means like a bride who's left standing at the altar. A bride jilted at the altar by her husband-to-be. To be rejected and abandoned by the one who proclaims to love you and that is wanting to dedicate themselves to you. Now, what does that do to the word forsaken? That if we forsake God, that it is just like a groom walking away from his bride. And that if we were to see this in person, we would just be in shock. We'd be in awe. Who could do such a thing? The embarrassment that you're putting this individual through. But why is it that a person would do that? Why is it that even after they get past this process, that a husband or a wife would decide to walk away from their mate? It's everything that we've been talking about. You're taking for granted what you have. Streams of living water for something else. You're forgetting about how good this is and desiring to have something else. And to walk away from this is to not to think about the other person involved. You're just simply thinking about yourself. When we are considering this element, and ultimately what we're discussing is rejection. Rejection is one of life's most difficult burdens. It's so difficult that even with the slightest feeling of rejection can result in sleepless nights and the shedding of bitter tears. That if anybody even catches a whiff that they might face rejection, they overreact to what's actually ahead of them. So as God is painting this picture of His people, and He says of them, "My people have forsaken me for something else." This is the picture. This is the imagery. To forsake comes from the Hebrew word azab, to leave. But not just to leave, but to leave one destitute. to refuse. This is the same word and the same imagery that is used to describe what would happen to the Levites. Deuteronomy chapter 14 and verse 27. God tells His people, you take care of the tribe of Levi. And the reason why is because you are being blessed with land and they are not. Levi did not have any section of the promised land cut out to them. They stayed with the tabernacle. They stayed with the temple. They ministered to the things of the tabernacle and the temple. They didn't go out and farm. They were being taken care of directly by God and by God's people. So then God says to the people, the Levite that is within thy gates, thou shalt not forsake him. There's our word. You will not leave him destitute. Because, or for, he hath no part nor inheritance with thee. To forsake the Levite, who has no land inheritance, would be to leave them destitute to die. And the question then has to be raised, why would God give such a warning? Such a command? Why would they leave behind destitute the Levites? You start to forget what the Levites are doing for you. Well, they're ministering to the temple so that you don't have to. They're ministering to the spiritual needs of the people. And they're doing that all day, every day. And they're doing that for you. So why in the world would you turn around and then decide, well, we're not going to take care of them anymore? You'd have to be a really cruel person to do that. But not just cruel. It happens to everybody. You forget. You get tied up in what you have going on. You get tied up in your needs. So just as Reese mentioned with the taking up the collection, we can get so fixated on, well, I need this money to go here, I need this money to go there, I need to pay this bill, I need to cover that, and so on and so forth. Who gets left behind? God does. That's what's happening with every person that forsakes, that wanders. You're leaving behind God. But you're not just walking away from Him and leaving Him behind. You're leaving Him behind as though He's destitute. God and man often have different perspectives on things. To where man's perspective on this, like we said, with that very basic and very generic definition of forsaking, to forsake, turn away from God, from man's perspective does not seem like a very serious thing. Yeah, I'm leaving the church, and yeah, I'm walking away from the truth that's presented there. Yeah, I'm turning back from God and going back out into the world. But nobody really views that as terrible as it actually is until we start viewing it from God's perspective. That God's been nothing but good to us. And that this is how He feels. For you to wander away is to be like leaving a bride at the altar. It's terrible. It's shameful. Well, that's how we need to think about wandering away from God. And then when we are tempted to do that, we don't. That problem that we just discussed, not viewing it as serious as it is, that's the problem that Old Testament Israel had. And even in their minds, they're not fully thinking, well, we're not really forsaking God. We're still worshiping God over here, but we're visiting other gods on the side. That's even worse. Now you're committing spiritual adultery. It's the same imagery. It's the same picture. What about a husband that runs around on his wife like that? Low down scoundrel. And that's right. And what about a person? What about a Christian that would say with the mouth, I love God, but then run around with idols? Scoundrel. Why would you do such a thing? In the days of Jeremiah, God is describing it. You don't realize how good you have it. You've forgotten how good it actually is. And you walk away. And that hurts the God that we're supposed to love. When we're considering the process in which Israel found themselves in to get to this level, they didn't just go out in full-blown idolatry. And so is the case with an unfaithful spouse. It usually starts small. You tread out into it, you start small, and then we run into the issue of, well, when we go out and we do these things, there's no swarm of locusts. There's no fire and brimstone that falls from heaven. There's no flame of fire that comes down from heaven. The world does not end when we do these things. When we wander away from God, like oftentimes it would happen in the Old Testament. So then we can begin to play around with this idea that, well, nothing's happening, so maybe it's not as bad as what we would think. But just because there's no physical tribulation, just because there is no physical turmoil or torment that comes along with those actions, here we have being depicted for us the emotional pain that comes from this. The emotional and the spiritual suffering that comes from one's walking and wandering away from God. And many times that emotional is far more painful than any physical that could be brought on a person. What we need to remember when we are tempted with the idea of forsaking God and wandering away from Him, that for us to do that, to reject Him in that fashion, shoots through the heart of a God that truly loves us. And that just as I would never walk out and leave behind my wife destitute, then I should never walk away from God. Jeremiah 3, notice how God describes the forsaking, the rejection of His people. The Lord said also unto me, in the days of Josiah the king hast thou seen that which backsliding Israel hath done. We've gone from forsaken now to backsliding. She has gone up upon every high mountain and under every green tree, and there hath played the harlot. This is God describing the people that He had joined together in covenant with. Do we really think that this is easy for God to say? Would this be easy for any husband to say of his wife, she's gone out and she's played the harlot? But that's what this is like. When we go out and we decide to live sinfully, we need to think about what it's doing to the other side. She's gone out, therefore, or there, and hath played the harlot. And I said, after she had done all these things, turn thou unto me. So even with what is going on, there is God still out there calling for His people to come back. Again, this should change our perspective on how God feels. Even though it does hurt, He's not giving up on us. That yes, God does become angry, but before He becomes angry, this is where He is. He's still there calling for His people. I said, after she had done all these things, turn thou unto me, but she returned not, and her treacherous sister Judah saw it. The bad behavior of Israel, the northern kingdom, is now causing the southern kingdom to do likewise. And I saw, when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel committed adultery. That's what our wandering, our forsaking is really like. We have been brought into covenant with God, and then we break that covenant. And it hurts. I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce, yet her treacherous sister Judah feared not. So even with this, we're back into our caring to correct study as to, well, why do we correct? Why do we implement church discipline? It's to help the ones that are in sin, but it's also to protect the others that have not committed sin. Her treacherous sister, Judah, feared not. She should have been afraid. But she wasn't. But Judah went and played the harlot also. And it came to pass, through the lightness of her whoredom, that she defiled the land and committed adultery with stones and with stocks. We're right back in our earlier material. Why did they do this? It's no big thing. It's no big deal. They made light of it. It's just a little unfaithfulness over here. Who's it really going to hurt? It hurts everybody. It hurts God. It hurts yourself. It hurts others inside of the kingdom of Israel that are being influenced by what you're doing. It's hurting Judah way down in the south by what you're doing. We look at these things and we raise the question as to how could a person do this? It's not that difficult. It's not hard to understand. We get so focused on ourselves. What I want, what I think I should have, how I think it should be. And we forget, we lose sight of how good it actually is now. That grass is always greener on the other side. And we just walk away. But all of these things are given to us for examples to learn from. There's no need for any of us here to try to walk away and to experiment to see if anything's better out there. Old Testament Israel already tried that. And here's what they learned. But that's the thing about human beings. A lot of times we got to learn the hard way. We've just got to go out and we've got to experiment with it. And it's like, well, I think I can do it differently. I think I can get a different result. No, the result's going to be the same. And here's what's going on during the process. So why should we remain faithful? Because I don't want to be labeled in any of these type of ways. In the sight of God, I do not want to be viewed as committing spiritual adultery, going out and practicing whoredoms. I don't want to have that labeled on me, but then also I do not want to have God feel the way that this is making Him feel. And a lot of times we forget about that. That God, even though He is a spirit, He is still able to feel. And before we get to the anger and before we get to the wrath, He feels pain. He feels sorrow. He feels hurt. But then even in the midst of all of that, He is still calling for His people to come home. And that's the whole reason. You could read this section of Jeremiah and then go over and read about the prophet Hosea. And understand why God told him, you go and marry a prostitute. To feel what I feel with the people that I love. Verse 20, surely as a wife treacherously departeth from her husband. There's our idea for forsaken. Surely as a wife treacherously departeth from her husband, so have ye dealt treacherously with me, O house of Israel, saith the Lord. They jilted God. They forsook Him. They rejected Him. And I'm sure that at some point in our lives, maybe not even to this degree and to this category, but we've all been in some area of rejection. We all know the pain that comes from the words and the actions that say, I do not love you anymore. That I'm choosing to be with someone else and not you. Even children end up having to taste or drink from that awful cup of rejection by either a father or a mother. And that those things that happen around us too often in our society, that we know about and that we realize are there, and that we would sit and ponder and we would question how awful that must be. And then to flip that over into the spiritual realm. How awful it must be when one of God's children reject their father. Now we just have to consider, when we're thinking about application for ourselves today, we may not be, as Old Testament Israel, that we are out here bowing down to stones and sticks like they were. More than likely, we do not have those physical idols like they had. But what we're needing to remember is that the physical idols represented something else. It wasn't just the thing of, well, I want this statue here. It's what that statue was supposedly bringing them that they desired. What ways do we forsake God today? By choosing not to live how He directs us. He tells us to live a certain way. And then we say, no, I'm going to go and live this way. That's forsaking. And so you see, we look at that today and it's like, well, you see, no, that's not nearly as bad as what Old Testament Israel was doing. It's one and the same. Here's how God says my attitude's supposed to be, but no, I just don't want to have that attitude. That's not me. I'm not that kind of person. Well, guess what? Christianity is all about changing you into that kind of person. Well, God says we're not supposed to let, certain things come before our eyes and certain things to go into our ears. But I'm going to let those things come in. That's forsaking. No longer having the desire to strive for right decision making. What difference does it make if I decide to not do this or do this? All of these things are designed to help direct us for our good and for our benefit. God is watching over His people as a husband would watch over his wife. And then we get ourselves into a position to where, doing the right thing, doing what's just, doing what is good is really not that important anymore. It's just not significant. What difference will my decisions make? Our choices, our decisions make huge differences in the lives of people around us and in how we affect God. This is just another way that we find ourselves hurting the God which loves us. And even in the New Testament, we have certain illustrations that are given to us, certain points given to us in the realm of forsaking. Hebrews 10, 24, 25. We have the word forsaken actually used for us in this context. And the Hebrew writer says, "And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works." So here we're adding another element as to who we're hurting when we forsake God. Here's the context of the church in your view of brethren. We're supposed to provoke unto love and to good works, the brethren. Well, guess what happens when we forsake the brethren? We reject them and turn our back on them. You're no longer a part of this. You're no longer involved in this work and in this help. One area in which we're able to do this is that we're not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much more as ye see the day approaching. What message is being sent to the brethren, but also to God? when we forsake the assembly. It's not just the assembly, it's the assembling. Any time that the brethren are getting together, and then I'm not there, what's that saying? Well, obviously there's something more important than you folk. We used to have brethren in Martinsville, and I'm sure you've run into them as well, that they would come in, and then they take the Lord's Supper, and then they'd leave the assembly immediately after taking the Lord's Supper. Most of the time they wouldn't even give. But they take the bread, and they take the juice, and then they leave the assembly. Because they had to go on a trip. And they would do that, and they would leave the rest of us there, and it's just, what are you saying about the assembly? What is your thinking of the assembly that it's, well, I can come in and do this little element, then I can say goodbye to everybody? What does it say about this time together? What does it say about us as we are involved in this time together? And what does that say about God? Well, it says that you do not love what's going on here enough to finish worshiping with us. It says to the rest of the assembly, and it says to the God of heaven, that you have more pressing matters to be concerned with and to deal with than to actually take the time and to stop and to go through all of this with us. That's rejection. And that brethren that have that kind of mentality are falling right back into the trap of Old Testament Israel. But they do not see it as a big deal. And they do not recognize that when they do that, they hit God in His heart. When they decide to turn back to worldly activity and to a worldly lifestyle. To turn back into the very world that God saved us from. He delivered us from that. And yet there's more desire and there's more attention being given over into those elements than to the elements that are actually going on here. But how little we actually think about it from this standpoint. It's just all, well, I got to get this done. I've got these things to handle, and everybody just needs to understand. No, you need to understand. Just how important this is. As we mentioned, when we do these things, there's no earthquake, there's no hurricane, there's no tornadoes or fire from heaven to swallow us up. And we fall into that snare and that temptation of what's the big deal. And in fact, very likely doing what multitudes have done before us. There's plenty of company in this line of living. But we have to ask the question, will a marriage work when both parties do not work at it? Obviously, the answer is no. But that's the way that people view this relationship with God. Well, everything is on God's responsibility to take care of, and I'm just kind of along for the ride. Just as a physical marriage, the husband has responsibilities, the wife has responsibilities. Both parties are involved to make the marriage cooperate. Same thing in Christianity. God has done His part. He's made everything available. He's provided all things that we need. And now it's on our part to fulfill our side. Be faithful. And even then, what is the recognition that God has? God recognizes that at some point we're going to be unfaithful. He knows it. And yet He still says, I want you. Why would we turn away from that? Well, it happens. And when it happens, we always need to remember that this is where God's position is. Hebrews 13:5, we serve a God that has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. We do not have to worry about God leaving us destitute. It's me I have to worry about. I never have to worry about God forsaking me, but I for sure have to worry about me forsaking God. God never stops working on His side. What we need to ask ourselves daily is the question, are you and am I working on my side? When we bring this into its fullest view, people that have been rejected, that have gone through rejection, they desire death instead of having to face a prolonged agony of living with that sickening realization that they have been rejected. That's how serious that element is. And that's the seriousness we need to put on this spiritual life that we're living and what it's really like when we wander away from God. Most of the times the mentality is when somebody walks away from the church, oh, well, that's too bad. Oh, what a shame. We say those cliche things. And then there's no reaction. That's part of the reason why there's no reaction to then try to go out and to get that person. We end up being like that older brother in the parable of the prodigal son. Well, if he's going to go, just let him go. I'm still here. I'm still doing what I'm supposed to do. Why didn't you go get your brother? You recognizing the goodness that's there, and then your brother wanders off. Why didn't you go get him home? Remind him of what he was walking away from. Remind him of what he was doing to your father by taking your inheritance and leaving. We look at that scene and we say, man, that's terrible. That's the scene we need to remember when someone walks away from God. You may not be feeling the hurt, but others are feeling the hurt. You're sending a clear message about how you feel about everybody else. Oh, well, I don't want to do that. Then come back. and be brought back into the fold, into the family that we're all wanting you to desperately be a part of. So as we close, and as we're airing this for those that are not members of the Lord's church, we're hoping that this will be a strong invitation so as to make you want to be a member of the Church of Christ. That while the denominations around us are teaching you that, well, when you receive Jesus into your heart, the Holy Spirit comes along and changes all of your desires to where you only desire what God wants you to desire, and that you're never going to fall away. That's not based in reality. That's not based in Scripture. And that produces more shame than what they supposedly think takes place here in the Church of Christ. Because over in that denominational realm, it really is the mentality, well, how could you? The Holy Spirit's supposed to be helping you. The Holy Spirit's supposed to be guiding you, and you've done something like this? That's not what the Bible teaches, and that's not how we operate in the churches of Christ. You do something, hopefully we're not going to be caught off guard by it. We're not going to be surprised. We're not going to be shocked. We're not going to come to you and just, how could you? Because we know this is a reality. At some point, every single one of us that's here is going to go through some time, through some turmoil that's going to cause you to walk away. And we are wanting to go through these studies so that we're better prepared, that when that time comes, we can go get you. We won't just sit back and say, oh, what a shame, and then just let you go out the door. That we'll be able to remind you and remind ourselves, this is what you're doing to us if you walk away. This is what you're doing to God if you walk away. Well, I don't want to put you guys through that. I don't want to put God through that. Then stay. And let's work through this. So for those of us that are members of the Lord's church, let us be encouraged that if we need to confess, that if we need to ask for encouragement, do not be afraid to do that. And be ready to accept help. Well, I don't want to bother anybody. I don't want to be a burden. You're not being a burden. This is what we're supposed to do. So let us fulfill our obligation. Let us fulfill our responsibility. So we can make it through this life together. So if anyone has a need, we ask that you come as we stand.